It's a paper with Javier, who couldn't make it for family reasons, and with Iva, who's also at the London School of Economics. I'm in Bordeaux myself, and it's a paper on automatic stabilizers, tax benefit automatic stabilizer. So when we compare tax benefit systems, usually we try to take into account their redistributive effects, and economists often incorporate also behavioral response, which is not done by policymakers. And there's one third element, which is automatic stabilization, which is overall rarely taken into account. Okay, so that's the point that we are making here. I'll give you a bit more insight on what I mean here by stabilization. So it's the ability of systems to mitigate income losses in times of downturns. So what it means that if there's an income shock, you may receive automatically more social assistance payment when social assistance is means tested. You may also pay less tax than you would normally do because of the tax progressivity, of the non-linearity of the tax system. So there are different elements in the instruments of a tax benefit system that make, especially through means testing and non-linearity of tax, and sometimes threshold also in social security contribution, that make that the variation in your net income, in your disposable income, is different from the variation in your gross income, and especially in times of a shock, the decline in your net income is not as important as the decline in your gross income. And we are interested usually by the macro perspective of this, how much that influences consumption, but also by the redistributive effect of these measures in times of shock, in times of upturn as well, but especially in times of shocks. So there's a lot of literature that is macro, that look at the correlation between government size and GDP volatility, or between the generosity of some of the tax benefit schemes or unemployment benefit and growth. But all the macro estimates are, even though they are interesting, they hide, of course, the heterogeneity that we can derive in terms of redistributive perspective, especially. And they are not able to disentangle, because they don't model what's going on at the micro level. They're not able to disentangle the effect of the proper effect of automatic stabilization from the specific measures that are introduced at the very same time. Okay, so it's exactly what we are going to do here. We're going to look at counterfactual tax benefit microsimulations, which is, so when you have a shock on income, you can actually look at the tax benefit parameter and say, okay, if we freeze them to the ex ante level, then what we're going to see in terms of change in tax level, in terms of benefit payment, is going to be the automatic stabilization effect. That is the change in this instrument due to the change in gross income for a given system that has not changed. Okay. And in this way, you can account for the heterogeneity across households for a given shock that's going to be a uniform shock, to make the analysis simple. So there's a lot of literature I mentioned here on stabilization for the US, for Europe, and more recently, and in particular thanks to wider initiatives and partners, with SouthMod and other microsimulation model for Africa and for Latin America, different papers I will mention a bit more in detail later. But in general, there's no global comparison, and global comparison is important, even though there were some work focusing on different countries within Latin America. For instance, it's important to have a global picture, precisely because you want to compare blocks. I wouldn't say continents, but more like, that could be more or less continent, but blocks, saying like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Europe, to compare these entities, and within them to compare also countries. So that's why it's very important to have the full picture, and that's what we suggest here. So we're going to have 50 countries. There's a huge mobilization of all these tax benefit models or simulators for all these countries. They're all based on microdata for each of these countries. And again, I mean, that's not us who put together all these things. That's, again, we drew from all the work by many people over the recent years. And we can focus on the different instruments, the link to micro indicator or poverty reduction indicator, and we're going to focus on informality as well, and say something about welfare. So the method is, I take the chance to pay homage to one of the former WIDER directors, Tony Shorrocks, where this not only his famous 82 paper, but there's a paper published in the Journal of Economic Inequality. This was a working paper for a long time, and which got finally published, and which is the 2012 paper, which is a useful generalization of ORHA-Blinder type of decomposition, where basically the idea is to have Shapley value approach, which we would use when we do tax decomposition. That is, you look at the effect of market income changes, and the effect of tax changes when you look at the overall changes in net income or of disposable income. So if you have gross income X, which is 1 minus an effective tax rates that can incorporate a lot of things, apply to the gross income Y, then you can have a behavioral response. Y depends on tax T, but I'm not going to say much about that today. But you can also decompose by having the effect of the discretionary measures of that period of time, over that period of time, delta tau here, which is really the policy effect, and you also have the stabilization effect, which is how much your net income varies, which is the first term here, how much your net income varies just because of this income shock delta Y for a given tax system tau, which is the one before the shock. Okay, so we used to suggest ORHA or Shorrocks type of decomposition in different papers focusing on policy effect. You want to know exactly what is due to when you see a change in tax or a change in benefit. You want to see how much it is due to the new measures, and not to the stabilization effect. And here we kind of reverse the perspective, and we want to know how much is due to the stabilization effect. So again, we draw from the WIDER's and partners micro-simulation infrastructure, which itself drew from the interface of Euromod. That was the set of simulators for Europe. So we have 28 countries from Europe. That's based on Euromod, and 14 from Latin America, and 8 from Africa. So the shock is going to be very simply a 5% reduction in income for everyone. Okay, so you could do a lot of different things, and probably more work would rely on more sensitivity analysis in that respect. And the change in income, in net income, delta X here is not just a change due to gross income and tax, it's also due to social contribution, benefits, and so on. And you can perform this kind of decomposition for specific instruments at a time. So the stabilization index is simply here the aggregation of all the people in your country of how much, so the net income, delta X, respond to a given change in the gross income, delta Y, okay, and reflects that this shock is going to be cushioned, is going to be that is going to benefit from the stabilization effect. And if you want to express that in terms of consumption, then you could add epsilon, which is just a consumption elasticity of disposable income. Or you can also see that in a totally different way. You could also see that epsilon as weights that you would put on different type of people in the population for more welfare interpretation. If you want to give more weights to the cushioning effect at the bottom of the distribution, for instance, compared to the top. So quickly on the results, here you have all the countries, and on the right, the blue, you have many European countries, red is Africa, and yellow is Latin America. And black is taxation, and white social contribution, and gray benefits. So you see a lot of the stabilization for the rich countries is due to tax, but also in Latin American countries and African countries, benefits play only a limited role here. And in particular for poor countries, and it's going to be one of the central elements, benefits play a very limited role simply because usually they are not means tested, they are based on proxy means test, for instance, so they don't adjust to the shock, to the change in people's income. Okay? If you focus now on Q1 of quintile 1 on the bottom of the distribution, for that reason, it's completely gone. I mean, there's really no stabilization effect for poorer countries in this picture. And for richer countries, of course, at the bottom of the distribution, a lot more is due to benefits. Okay? If you look at the rich at the top quintile, then you see the effect of taxation of income tax across the board with variation that we could interpret. Now I'm giving you a correlation here with social protection spending, vertically and horizontally. That's our stabilization coefficient. And the correlation is pretty high, but it's mainly due to the difference between blocks. There's some correlation, for instance, for Europe within the European bloc here, but there's also a lot of heterogeneity. It might not be due to only spending, maybe targeting is important. So now I look at vertically at the reduction in poverty due to the tax benefit system. And again, you see a correlation, but you see also a lot of variation within the groups of countries here. Okay. Now, if you look at redistribution, which is the variation in the Gini coefficient, so it's more a question of inequality than poverty, then it incorporates what's going on also at the top of the distribution or at the middle of the distribution, and we said that tax is important, it's probably the main instrument, and we expect more correlation in that respect, so between stabilization and the reduction in inequality due to the tax benefit system, and that's exactly what you see here with strong correlation due to blocks so across and also within in this picture. Now we simulate here for each country, we have the baseline, and we have one form, which is when you assume that all the labor force is formalized. So you see a bit of variation, of course a bit of increase in stabilization, but not so much. And that was a surprising result because you expect that a lot is due to the fact that there's a lack of coverage due to informality. So that's an interesting result here, I think. That's one of the things I'm going to conclude on that. Another thing we did is to put some higher weight at the bottom of the distribution and lower weight at the top. Maybe we should have had weights summing up to 100%, but because it's not the case, you see in red that the weighted aggregate stabilization index is going down, but it's simply, I mean, the two things are not comparable in level. What's interesting is to see that you keep the ranking as before. There's not much re-ranking when you do that. And for Latin American and African countries, you see that we would have to zoom a little bit, but you see that a lot of the stabilization disappears when you do that, again, because there's no means-tested benefit system. So to conclude, I'll say two things. One is explanation, because we don't have a formal demonstration for these things, but we could mention three reasons for a lack of stabilization overall, which is one, low tax progressivity, which is true also in some of the European countries. I'm thinking about Baltic countries. When they started to re-implement the tax system, they went for something simple and a flat tax. So that explains some of the heterogeneity within Europe, for instance. And in Latin America, you have a lot of tax exemption and deduction, so that explains also the lack of stabilization in that respect. The second point is a low tax coverage. Again, the simulation with global formalization of the labor force showed that there's not so much difference So it explains only a modest part of the lack of stabilization. And the third point, I mentioned it several times, that's the insufficient means test of benefits, which is hard to do because it's very hard to assess the income of people in many different places in the world. But that's really part of one big part of the picture here. It does not include emergency policies, so these discretionary policies. If we had many more years, we could actually decompose the stabilization effect between the automatic stabilization effect and new policies, and a lot has already been done in that respect for the period of time, of course, of the pandemic. The paper by Gentilini, that document all the evolution of all this, initiative all over the globe. I mean, it was a huge push for many new measures. Sometimes it was just cancelling the conditionality on conditional cash transfer or other ways to, quickly implement some emergency aid for low-income households. We have a paper with Amin Janov showing that help people to stay at home and not to be contaminated by the pandemic, because poverty was highly correlated with the lack of compliance to these stay-at-home policies. And then you have all the papers by the colleagues, especially at WIDER, and co-authors doing exactly that is to decompose the effect of automatic stabilization and the effect of new measures. So that would be, something that we could systematize, that we could do more systematically for other points in time and other shocks over a longer period of time. I should stop here. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much.